Welcome to the 200th episode of Ufahamu Africa, a podcast about life and politics on the African continent. I'm Kimmy Dion, one of your hosts, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Rachel Beatty-Riedel. Hi, Rachel. Happy 200th episode.
Hi, Kim. Hello, listeners. So it's kind of funny because you can't see the visual, but Kim and I are doing our happy celebration dance. And so we hope you are joining us. Give us a like wherever you subscribe or follow and share this episode. We think it's going to be a good one. It's an important conversation that is stemming from a panel last week at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies that was held at Notre Dame at their Global Democracy Conference for 2024. So big thanks go to our friends at Kellogg, in particular, the director, Anibal Perez-Linon, and the podcast Mashup with Kellogg's Global Stage podcast. So this week, we're going to build on the conversation that we had there about the return of military coups across the continent, and particularly in the Sahel. And this was a panel that featured one of our former episode participants, Jamie Black at the University of Notre Dame, and Joseph Asunka, at the director of the Afrobarometer, and Nani Singh, another former guest on the podcast, who is at U.S. Naval War College. So following this conversation, Joseph Asunka and I had the opportunity to sit down with Notre Dame grad student Rashid Ibrahim for the conversation and our takeaways that you'll listen to today. And I just want to say, stay tuned for a bonus episode this summer, which will be the full set of panelists, including Jamie and Nana Hall. And while we're introducing Joseph Asunka, I also want to celebrate another anniversary, Afrobarometer, 25 years. Wow. Congrats to our friends at Afrobarometer.
Yes, happy 25th year to our friends at Afrobarometer. They are currently fundraising, and we'll have a link in our show notes to a page where people can send their support of the work that Afrobarometer does to bring African people's voices to a broader audience, including making sure that those voices are heard by policymakers and people in corridors of power who can influence various health and development interventions, as well as democratic and market interventions. And I think they've been doing great work for decades now. And whatever we can do to support their work, to make sure that they're sustainable going forward so that they can continue collecting data across the continent, it's a benefit to all of us. I'm really excited to hear your conversation with Jamie, Joe, and Nani Hall later this summer when we have that bonus episode. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Rashid draws out of you and Joe in this intimate conversation that he had with all of you. So big thanks to the folks at Notre Dame for making that happen. Okay, now we're sure all of our listeners, like the big news this week is the elections in South Africa, right? So we had that episode last week with Carolyn Holmes, giving us a sense of what's at stake, what's happening, what's likely to happen. And we just want to report at the time of recording, right? We're recording on Thursday, so it's still a bit early. By the time you hear this on Saturday, things may be different. But according to a partial count of the South African election, the ruling party in South Africa, the African National Congress, the ANC, is, as predicted by most pre-electoral polls, going to lose its majority. Again, at the time of recording, South Africa's Electoral Commission, called the IEC, was reporting that 22.1% of votes had been counted. And of those votes, the ANC had only won 43% of the vote, while the largest opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, or the DA, had won almost 25% of the vote. Now, those are big switches from the 2019, right? We're seeing ANC losing support, DA gaining support, but again, it's only a fifth of the votes have been counted. And also importantly, the economic freedom fighters may have also lost ground. Currently, they stand at about 8% of support. And that's the same share of the vote that upstart party Umkhonto we Sizwe, or MK as it's known, has won. Now, the MK is this new party started by, among others, Jacob Zuma, right? And Zuma has all of this influence, in particular in KwaZulu-Natal. And that's where it seems, at least according to the Electoral Commission's beautiful website that's mapped results, right? It seems like MK is getting a lot of its support from KwaZulu-Natal. Of course, things will likely change in the coming days as results from more polling stations get added to the Election Commission's national tally. So we encourage our listeners to check out the official results page that is being updated regularly, and we'll post a link to it in our show notes.
Thanks, Kim. Exactly right. So really interesting, exciting, momentous results coming in. And if these final results are confirmed, the loss of the majority for the ANC, of course, what that means is that the ANC will be forced to make a deal with one or more other parties to govern. So this situation is, it's the most uncertain that we've really seen South Africa since the end of apartheid, with just a sense of political volatility around what will be the makeup of that coalition. Now, ANC's support has declined, as we heard from last week's guest, Carolyn Holmes, in her conversation with Kim, for a number of reasons. But kind of overarching, we know that there's largely discontent because of high unemployment, poverty, crime and insecurity, and these frequent power blackouts, the lack of electricity that makes it really difficult to do business and carry out everyday life, and corruption, right? These are some of the big ticket items that people are focusing on across South Africa. And Kim, as I've been digging around in, different data on South Africa over the last week and, thinking about this election, one report on inequality I cannot stop thinking about, it's like haunting my dreams, is put out by the Inequality Lab that's affiliated with Thomas Piketty, and showed that South Africa's wealth gap has remained unchanged since the end of apartheid. That is, since 1993, the overarching kind of economic data means that inequality in general has not changed. Now, there's been certainly a number of Black South Africans who've risen to the very, very top, right? So among that top 1%, top 10%, there are more Black South Africans in the top rung of economic class. But overall, a large number of poor Black Africans remain at the bottom. And this is despite, right, 30 years of social policy from 1993 to 2023, 2024, that has really focused on narrowing that gap, right? Social policy, successive governments in South Africa have, endorsed ambitious socioeconomic policy frameworks whose primary objective consistently included reducing economic inequality that was inherited from colonial and apartheid regimes. And yet, this wealth inequality has remained remarkably stable. In South Africa today, the richest 10% of the population own more than 85% of household wealth, while over half of the population have more debt than assets, according to this report. That gap is higher than any other country for which sufficient data is available. And the richest 1% in South Africa have likely increased their share of wealth since the end of apartheid. So, this is really striking, and it's suggestive to us when we think about what democracy, full enfranchisement of the population is meant to bring. And that the leading ANC has always had inequality at the top of its agenda. The democratic government has not been able to wipe away this legacy of apartheid, colonialism, and narrow the imbalance between rich and poor. It's really quite striking.
Yeah, so I think it was during the Fees Must Fall movement. This is when, roads must fall, right? So Carolyn Holmes in our interview last week, she kept referring to the fallist movement, and she's referring to all of these different mostly student-led protests. And it was during that time when I was watching that unfold, and I was, following the news and also social media, because I think a lot of fallist leaders were really active in sharing their views online, and that was when Twitter was great, right? It was like the peak Twitter moment where you could actually learn things about other places and not just about Nazis. But I started a new practice after the Fees Must Fall movement of not saying the end of apartheid. And that's because I think the fallist activists make a really clear case that, like, there's still quite a bit of separation, right? So it's not state sanctioned political apartheid. Like that certainly ended in the early 90s. And I'm not questioning that. But I think that they and then subsequently many others make a very clear case that economic apartheid still exists, right? That yes, of course, there are rich Black South Africans, right? Super uber wealthy. Like we're not just talking rich, but like super uber wealthy. And there are, of course, um, Black South Africans in the middle class. But if you actually look at things, right, the the um, the legacies of colonialism and political apartheid are quite strong in in people's economic possibilities
Yeah,
for themselves and their children.
exactly, Kim. And that's one of the, kind of details that this report goes into. Of course, geographic segregation based on this political system still shapes life opportunities for so many people in that the townships were built and constructed around the political apartheid. And it leaves
Mhm.
many people, you know, very far away from places of work. And the education system is still so unequal in terms of preparing, you know, the next generation for productive workplace opportunities. So the structural and social and geographic elements of apartheid that you mentioned are still, these very strongly structuring opportunities in South Africa today.
And so so again, these elections in South Africa are coming at a very interesting moment. And you know, it's not going to be business as usual. And this is why, here at Ufamo Africa, we've been really kind of focused on these elections and thinking about them a lot. Also, at Good Authority, where I'm editor in chief, we published a series on the South African election ahead of Wednesday's polling. And one of the people who wrote for us was last week's podcast guest, Carolyn Holmes. In her piece, she talks a little bit about racial politics, but she goes long on contextualizing young people's political engagement, not just at the ballot box in South Africa, which I think is really important. But the post that kicked off the series is a great long read by LSE political scientist and quantitative scholar and South African politics expert, Dan de Cat. In that piece, Dan tells us why this election is so pivotal and who the key figures and parties are. And importantly, he goes long on the electoral rules. And I think this is really important because who writes the rules is like who's going to win the game, right? So I think just the electoral rules in South Africa are different than most African countries. And so I think, he offers us a really nice detailed explainer, and he also tells us about recent changes in the electoral rules and what the likely impact those will have. Now, he links to a few of his articles in that piece, but I want to draw our listeners' attention to one in particular. And that's an article that Dan co-authored with Ada Johnson Kanu and Melissa Sands that examines the political legacy of the Marikana massacre. Now, through their dogged analysis, they document how a new opposition party, this is the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, formed as a direct result of people responding to state-sponsored violence against workers in the Marikana mine in 2012. It's a really important article. I'm glad to see it published in the flagship journal of our discipline, Political Science, where it's published in the American Political Science Review, and it's um, it's really careful social science about a deeply, deeply tragic event that happened. And I mean, we were just talking about legacies, right? Like when these things happen, right, there are reverberations into the future. And I think that's just really carefully done. So read his long post, but also read this APSR article that he co-authored. And I'll just talk quickly about the other two pieces in the series that we've already published. So one is an interview with Shelley Liu, who's an assistant professor at the Stanford School of Policy at Duke. She focused her piece on misinformation and disinformation in the South African elections. And what I really appreciated was the list of fact-checking websites that she shares at the end of the interview. So if anyone's, looking to, debunk or check, if something's factual, like go to her piece and see like what she offers for you to check that out with. And then finally, there is a great interview with Beth Wellman. She's a migration expert, and she discussed a key issue in this year's election, and that's immigration. And, we talk, about, South Africa, I think for many Africans, is known as a great destination for economic opportunity because it is an economic hegemon. It's also a place known for its xenophobia and its attacks on foreigners. And so we talk a little bit about campaign rhetoric that parties and candidates are using to try, to garner support in a way, kind of blaming the other, right? And in this case, migrants. We also talk about her research on diaspora voting, which is important. And those results, I think, are already the diaspora, because South African voters who are out of the country can still vote. They have to vote before the elections, like in the country, but I think those results are also already available on the IEC's website. So we're grateful to learn from Beth Wellman. Hopefully we'll have her on the show sometime soon to talk about her cool work. She's a political scientist at the University of Memphis, and I just love how thoughtful she is in thinking about migration broadly, but also like the deep fieldwork that she's done in South Africa and elsewhere. I think once we shared an episode of Scope Conditions, where she was interviewed on that show, on that podcast that we love, where she talks about her research with diaspora voting, and I love her work, and I like the thoughtfulness that she brings to it.
Kim, thanks so much for sharing that. I'm really excited to learn from Beth Wellman's work, and in particularly, to have a conversation with her about immigration more generally. So I also want to just remind our listeners to stay tuned for next week's episode by our fellows Ami and Fu about LGBTQ legislation in Ghana. And that's particularly relevant because we've just seen a report yesterday that Ghana's Supreme Court has given the go-ahead for live broadcasting of a court case in Ghana involving a controversial anti-LGBTQI bill. So this will be a really interesting moment, I think, in Ghana, because on one hand, it will promote transparency around the judicial system. And on the other hand, it may make things kind of even more difficult or potentially hostile for Ghanaians in that LGBTQ community. So that's a piece that Godfried Asante writes in The Conversation. So check that out as well, and stay tuned for next week.
Looking forward to next week's conversation that Ami and Fu have curated. And now let's have a listen to Rachel's conversation with Joe Asunka, the CEO of Afrobarometer, and Rashid Ibrahim, a graduate student at Notre Dame.
Hello, welcome to the Global Stage podcast. My name is Rashid Ibrahim. I'm a PhD student at the University of Notre Dame. Today I've got two wonderful guests, Dr. Asunka and Professor Riedel. So Joseph Asunka is currently the CEO of Afrobarometer, a role which is held since April 2021. He was previously the program officer in the Global Development and Population Program at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And he's managed portfolios of grants and efforts to increase transparency and accountability in fiscal governance. Before joining Hewlett, Dr. Asunka was also a lecturer in political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. And his research broadly focuses on African politics, political economy of development, distributive politics, elections, and electoral processes. He's also a program officer with the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, which is also a core partner of the Afrobarometer. He's published works in BJPS, Research and Politics, and Population Research and Policy Review. and he holds a PhD from University of California, Los Angeles. Welcome to the Global Stage Podcast.
Thank you.
And we have here too Professor Riddle, who is the Inodi Center's director, and also John S. Knight Professor of International Studies, and also professor in the Department of Government and the Brooks School of Public Policy. So you can tell she's very busy. Her research interests include institutions in democracies and autocracies, local governance and decentralization policy, authoritarian regime legacies, democratic resilience, and religion and politics, and with a regional focus on Africa. She's published work in the Cambridge University Press. In fact, not just one, I think a couple of them, both of which I think are must-reads. The Journal of Politics, Perspectives on Politics, and so many other journals. And we're happy to have you here. She has been a visiting fellow at several prestigious institutions, including the Yale Program on Democracy, our own Kellogg Institute for International Studies, and the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. She's a co-host of the podcast Ufahamu Africa, which you're free to talk about it in the end. I think that is also a great podcast on African politics, and we're happy to have you here today. Professor Riddle holds a PhD from Princeton University. Welcome to the Global Stage Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I'd like this to be more of an open discussion, and so you're happy. I'm happy for you to just jump in anytime. But I wanted us to start with the recent waves of coups in sub-Saharan Africa. What does this really mean for democracy on the continent? Because when we look back to the early to mid-1990s, where countries like Mali and I guess several other countries were beginning to show signs of democratization, and it was, in a way, the story was that this is really great, right? We're going to observe several democratic developments over time, and that was the case. Really, we observed democratization for a period of time, and then now the story is somewhat different. We're observing military coups. And some are saying, well, this is new. Some are saying it's not exactly new. It might be, really, it was just a short hiatus that happened in between, right? So what does this really mean for democracy on the continent?
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks, Rashid, for hosting us here. It's great to be back at Kellogg. I was here last year to talk about these issues. I think last year we didn't talk about military coups that much, and now it's become the talk of town. In terms of what it means for democracy, I think there are two things to say here. One, that the general trend that democracy is declining globally, it's continued to be the story. But sometimes based on the data that we have from Afrobarometer, we often want to make the distinction between the supply side and the demand side. Okay. In terms of citizens' commitment to democracy and democratic governance and democratic norms on the continent, by and large, there is still that strong support for all these institutions of democracy. So democracy as a system of government, but also all the institutions that go with it, still continue to receive majority support from across the continent. So we often make the argument that the demand side is not lacking. So even in the midst of the coups, in those countries that are ruled by military regimes now, the popular support for democracy is still very high. And so on the citizen side, we don't see, even though we have seen it taper off a little bit over time, there's still that solid commitment to democracy. The challenge comes on the supply side, that elected leaders are unable to meet the democratic aspirations of citizens. And it has become increasingly clear that elected leaders are just not living up to citizens' expectations. And it's not that they're expecting anything more than what a democratic government should deliver. But the first priority is actually the political goods. Of course, the economic goods are important, but if you look at what has happened over the last 5 years, some of the issues that Africans are concerned about and the ways in which democracy could suffer, is the fact that elected leaders are unable to deliver clean elections. And so if elections do not empower citizens to change non-performing governments, then the issue of their commitment to democracy becomes a lot less strong. And that has been what we've been observing over time. So whether the military regimes have implications on democracy or not, I think is on the supply side more, that citizens are not satisfied and they wish that something would change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree, Joseph. I think those are really key points that you're making around, what is the demand from citizens to have functional, democratic, participatory, inclusive government that works for their needs, right? That's what democracy is meant to provide, and it is a challenge. And so when we look at the 9 successful coups that have happened in Africa since 2019, right? In Burkina Faso, Chad, Gabon, Guinea, Mali, Niger, and Sudan, we see that there are these kind of fundamental underlying currents that Joseph is referring to, right? Around the concerns around insufficiency of electoralism, that there are protracted kind of political dysfunctions, and electoralism alone is not resolving the kinds of governance demands that citizens want to have responded to. The second is really a question about security and the need to provide political order across territory. And this takes us to the age-old question of the relationship between security and democracy, or the relationship between order and liberty, right? So you need to provide a certain level of order to be able to guarantee liberties. And so coups that are happening in these countries are often justified as a kind of temporary fix or an interim solution to get to that pathway of governmental reform. And the third factor that we need to see in a kind of regional context is really a reactionism to anti-North or anti-Western interventionism, a way in which France in particular, the relationship with a large number of former Francophone colonies, continues to map on the global kind of lens of security and the fight on terror in ways that may be counterproductive or not meeting the governance demands of local populations. And so we see this very much in kind of the support people. When the people come out to cheer on a coup in the street, they're often waving Russian flags, kind of anti-French interventionists. So we see that as a set of interrelated patterns. And so in Burkina, Chad, Mali, Niger, and Sudan, when those coups were successful, they all justified power in terms of security grounds. In Gabon and Guinea, those coups were justified in terms of elected political incumbents successfully abolishing term limits. So they were justified as remedies to political dysfunction. So we see that these are rhetorics. They're not necessarily delivering on those grounds. The military governments are not providing better outcomes, but these are the underlying patterns that, are shaping the return of coups in this particular moment.
Yeah. So thank you. 2 wonderful perspectives on this, and I think they speak to each other. I would want us to look at the demand side more. I think from the Afrobarometer perspective, from the data at least, we do see that the military do enjoy some kind of support from in fact, an enormous support, not just a trivial support, right? Quite significant support. How do we reconcile this with demand for democracy? Because elsewhere we always think of the military as antithetical to democracy, right? Whenever you think of military, you're thinking, well, we can't think of democracy in terms of military. But on the African continent, people really do trust the military, and they trust them as sometimes as the guardians of democracy. So what does this really mean? How do we reconcile a public that demands democracy, but at the same time also has a very high support for the military?
they do not want them to be the ones ruling. Right. And so that's a distinction to make. So you would see that on the African continent, the majority of citizens have continued to reject military rule. So rejection of military rule has always been a majority view across the countries that we have surveyed to date. And especially across at least 30 countries that we have over time data for about 10 years now, it's about 65% rejection on average. This is of course, is a drop over time. In 2014, even earlier, the percentage was around 75%. So near about 3/4 of Africans rejected military rule sometime 10 years back. Today, the number is lower, but it's still a majority view, 65%. So there's a 10 percentage point decline in the number of people who reject military rule. And so that rejection is there. The trust in the military is more about the belief in an institution that is disciplined and seen as having some moral standing that is far beyond the political class. And so they would always rank the military above the presidency, the members of parliament, as well as the judiciary. But then what most Africans don't also want is an elected leader that abuses office. Right. So the recent surveys, we asked Africans, if your elected leader abuses office, do you think the military should come in? And then we recorded about a marginal majority, about 53% saying that yes, they should intervene. And so what they call for, because they trust the military, they see them as a temporary change agent that could step in when things are going bad, but the hope is that they'll return to constitutional rule. Right. And so you would see support for intervention is a majority view, but military rule is rejected by the majority of the citizens. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with that viewpoint. And I think another important aspect to take into account is that citizens are contesting and claiming for democracy in a variety of ways, and they're looking for institutions that they can trust. And this kind of trust for the military as a transition institution to get them to the democracy that they want is in part an institution of last resort, right? Mm-hmm. So we see, for example, in places where other channels are working, that, for example, in Senegal, the recent elections in which, citizens voted overwhelmingly for change. They didn't vote for the incumbent party because the courts and the parties and the candidates gave them that opportunity to bring in an outsider, an anti-establishment new leader for the country to try something different. And so that's an example in which the elections are providing those channels, the judicial institutions are providing those channels, and increase in trust in those institutions will be bolstered by that experience. And so one thing is, in terms of what are the potential ways to get to that democracy that's working. A second factor is seeing the role of the military is often looked to as the solution to this security problem that many countries that I've listed are facing. And so, in some cases, in Nigeria, for example, the alternative to the coup is electing the former military general, right, to bring the military in, but through those more constrained measures, but still saying, we want this to be able to solve the problem of security. We hope that Buhari, for example, can do better against Boko Haram and the threats that we face. Another way in which trust in the military is altered is when the state forces themselves can worsen the security situation. When state forces are used and pro-government militias are used against non-state extremist actors, trying to address the security situation, but they can commit extrajudicial killings during counterterrorism operations. They can worsen sometimes the security situation on the ground, particularly in rural areas. So when the coercive arm of the state is deployed in ways that sometimes worsen the security situation, that too is, raises questions about how effective the military can be in these really, structural constraints that they're facing.
I mean, that's an important point to raise, and especially the issue of security. So over time, we have been asking African citizens, what is the most important problem that you think your government should solve? And this has always been, unemployment is always on top, followed by health, education. Of course, the last survey, we saw that management of the economy moved up. But in certain countries, crime and security became a bigger concern, even much more than health. And so in countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, Nigeria, we saw that crime and insecurity was becoming increasingly a concern. And this is where then you have the combination of insecurity and you have a military that seems to be the only factor institution that can actually impact security to some extent. And you would see citizens being drifted towards that view because they feel that there's a sense that the military could do better at dealing with security. And if that becomes your primary, concern, you can see the military as being a good alternative.
Yeah. This is really great. I think in a way you preempted the question I was going to ask, but I'll reframe it this way. So I want us to look at the supply side. And here I want you to think of like two things here. First of all, is it episodic, or is it just could we expect this to last a while, or can we expect to go back to a civilian rule anytime soon? But at the same time, I'm also curious about what the data is saying. What predicts this supply of, military coup? And you've mentioned that in many of these cases, civilians that you've surveyed do mention that crime and security is a top priority that the government should focus on. And so I wonder if there are any other predictors of this coup, and should we be worried? Are we seeing these signals in other places as well? And is there something we can do about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, one that we're all putting our minds to because the consequences are so great. And so, just building on some of Nanehal Singh's work, the greatest predictor of coups is, the past coups. So Mali, 2012, right? Burkina's transition away from the long-standing rule of Blaise Compaoré was to bring in an interim military government as this, promissory coup, transitory government to help get to elections. So where you have coups happening now, I'm very concerned that, you're in this kind of difficult cycle where the demand is there, but then the military can't actually deliver on that demand for security and better governance. And then you're more likely to have another coup from within, as we've seen in Mali recently. So there become these kind of cyclical patterns. So you're more likely to see the maintenance of coups or continuation of new coups. Also where you have neither really well-established democracy, as we've seen democracy kind of functioning well in Ghana, moved away from a history of coups. We've seen democracy channeling out difficult candidates or questions as South African courts, made a really big decision about Jacob Zuma's candidacy. These are ways in which the institutions can provide alternatives to the coup pathway. So where you have democratic institutions working as, systems of horizontal accountability, you're more likely to be able to avoid. So too, where you have strong authoritarian rule, so where you have either stable democracy or fairly stable authoritarianism, you might be able to avoid this middle ground of the coup trap. And then where you have, I think state capacity is not exactly related to overall levels of economic development, but they're certainly correlated. Yeah. So where you have this kind of weak state capacity, the inability to really broadcast the power of the bureaucracy, the police, etc., across the national territory, there is the way in which the security conundrum has been experienced is in part because of a weak state capacity in the first place. And of course, then the kind of regional fallout from the civil war in Libya in 2011 has spread a number of violent actors, non-state actors across this region. So it's not a surprise that it's concentrated geographically. Yeah. And so that, to me, says we're not likely to see a kind of coup contagion, right, but that the structural factors that have led to this set of coups are not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the structural factors are there, and she's already covered some of the drivers. What I want to add is it's always the case of what is the alternative, or what are some of the institutions, democratic institutions, to which citizens can turn to if they want a way out. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if your elected government is abusing power, is there a mechanism for them to get out of that without the military coming in, intervening? If there's no opportunity or other options, that's when the military intervention gets this popular support. You see people celebrating in the streets because they feel like a system was in an equilibrium that could not be moved until the military comes in. But if there are other sets of institutions that can function well, and here I particularly mean the judiciary. If the judiciary can be effective, as Rachel was saying, that is another opening or opportunity for citizens to find the democratic norms that they are really yearning for, because citizens on the continent are so committed to the norms of democracy, to the extent that if the judiciary can step in, especially when it comes to electoral dispute, and make a decision that is acceptable generally to the population, it then creates this image of greater trust in the judiciary, just like there's that trust in the military. There is an alternative institution that can allow them to exercise their democratic aspirations, or at least achieve their democratic aspirations in some way. So having those mechanisms, and I'll add to this the electoral commissions or the electoral management bodies. Yes. The extent to which citizens trust that institution is also critical in determining whether or not they believe they have an opportunity to get out of that particular situation. So if your elected leaders are abusing power and elections are coming up, do you have the opportunity to kick them out? If citizens trust in their electoral commission, they don't have to resort to the military. But if they don't trust the electoral commission, they don't trust the judiciary, then the military becomes the only option, because that's the most trusted institution. And I hope that as we look forward, thinking about ways to make other institutions trustworthy is super critical.
Could you think of any other mechanisms that could help break this cycle of coups, right? Because in a way it sounds like the countries just they're in coups and they get years of no coups or peace or whatever, or democracy, rather than the other way around. So how do we break this cycle?
Yeah, I mean, luckily the continent has had has had success.
Right.
Not luckily that they've had past coups, but luckily they have had success in breaking the cycle. Yeah. Really moving out of the 1980s through the 1990s until 2019, we were really in a stage where domestic sanctions and pressures and norms moved away from coups as being acceptable. International pressures, norms moved away from coups as being acceptable. And so both in terms of intra-military dynamics and regional dynamics, we really moved away from any kind of coup during that time period. That's not to say that movement, towards democracy was always happening, right? We saw different ways in which democracy died, in particular, or eroded, or experienced backsliding, because instead of a military coup ending democracy, democratic institutions were used to end democracy, right? So where judiciaries didn't support democracy and legislatures didn't support democracy by passing repressive measures against the opposition or limiting civil liberties and freedoms of the media, etc., expanding executive power rather than providing checks on it. All of those ways, were a different mode of democratic decline. And so from 1990 to 2019, one would have said, we've really moved away from democratic decline by coup, and we're in democratic decline by institutions. And so I absolutely think that, we will shift again. There's no steady state, particularly because coups and the military juntas that follow them are inherently unstable.
Right. Yeah. So typically I like to end with on a good note. So I would like to, any final comments, any reason for hope? Do you...
two reasons for hope. One, that Africans' commitment to democracy is very solid. And had it been giving the experiences of the poor delivery of quality democratic governance, people would have lost hope completely. But that is not the case. And so that's reason for optimism. I think the second piece of it is the increasing positive role of the judiciary. It's becoming clear that if the judiciary really wants to perform as an independent institution, they can deliver good quality, democratic governance. And my hope is that we'll continue to work more and more on judicial independence. And luckily, Afrobarometer is working on this issue as well, trying to figure out ways that we can support interventions that drive judicial independence on the continent. So those are the two things I'm holding on to as our hope.
I totally agree. I think, I would also just add that this generation has seen the power of democratic contestation. They believe in it, as Joseph is saying, and they know the power of their voice. And they can look to neighbors to see how that's playing out, in just across a border. So citizens in Mali had the experience of national conferences and creating new constitutions and seeing what those transitions looked like to democracy. And they see these military interventions as ways towards a better democracy. They have the desire to get to governance that works for them, and they know the power of their voice. And so that is always a sign of agency and hope for me.
All right. Thank you very much. Well, folks, that's it for now. And it's been wonderful having the both of you here. And we really appreciate having you on Notre Dame campus.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa. You can find more episodes, show notes, and transcripts on our website, ufahamuafrica.com. This podcast is produced and managed by Megan DeMint, with help from production assistants Chukwufunanya Ikechukwu, Alex Kozak, Harry Stoltz, and Michere Muguero. Our non-resident podcast fellows are Ami Tamaklo, Fu Asedu, Exthidi Olagu, Basil Ibrahim, and Hopalong Botul Kane. We are generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and receive research assistance from Cornell University and the University of California, Riverside. Our music is courtesy of Kevin McLeod. Until next week, Safiri Salama.